Orrin had shod horses at Dunvale for 31 years, and he had learned that the health of a great house lived in its sound. In a good year you heard the carpenter's mallet from the North Lane, and the dairymaids arguing over the butter, and the forge going from first light. He heard none of that now. He heard a bailiff's man raising his voice at the woodyard gate, and he heard Miss Willa Dunmore set her satchel down in the mud and walk toward it. Everyone else in the village walked the other way. Reuben Coates was the finest joiner in 3 parishes, a man who could read a timber frame the way a physician reads a chest, by pressing his palm flat and listening. He stood in front of his own workshop with his hands loose at his sides, while 2 of the estate agent's men dragged his tool chest toward a cart. The chest was walnut, built by his father. It held planes and chisels older than Reuben himself. A joiner without his tools is a miller without his millstone. And Reuben knew it and said nothing, because 40 years of working for the Braye family had taught him that complaint was a coin spent mostly by people who could afford to lose it. Willa did not shout. She had grown up watching her father preside at circuit court, and she had learned from him that a raised voice was almost always the sound of a losing argument. She walked up to the cart, set her hand on the latch of the tool chest, and asked pleasantly to see the warrant for distraint. The bailiff's man blinked. She asked again to see the document authorizing the seizure of a freehold tradesman's tools, the notice of outstanding debt it claimed to recover, and the date on which that debt was alleged to have fallen due. The man had no document. He had an instruction from Mr. Huxley Nairn, the estate's land agent, written on half a sheet of foolscap, and when Willa read it aloud, it said only that Coates had failed in his obligations, and that his materials were to be secured against the estate's losses. She said that she happened to have, in her satchel, the counterpart receipts for Reuben Coates's last 3 contracts with Dunvale, all signed by Mr. Nairn himself, all marked paid in full, and that if Mr. Nairn disputed them, she would be very glad to lay them before the nearest magistrate's court, where the procedure for wrongful distraint was well established, and the penalties were specific. She produced the receipts. She had them because she kept records the way her father had taught her, methodically, and always with the counterpart. The men looked at one another, then they looked past her. A horseman had stopped in the lane. He sat very still on a grey horse, wearing the expression of a man who has been away from his own land long enough to find it foreign. She knew him from the funeral 3 weeks prior, where he had stood through the whole of it, without once looking at the grave. Sir Cormac Braye, the new baronet, returned from 4 years in the garrison at Halifax to bury his mother and settle her affairs. He watched the bailiff's men retreat with the empty cart. He looked at Willa for a long moment. His face gave her nothing. Then he rode on. That evening Orrin told her, in the way he told things, quietly, with his hands busy over a bridle so it should not look like gossip, that his lordship had spoken with Nairn, and that the companion was to be let go with the rest of the household. Willa received this without visible change. She was 24 years old, and had been earning her own way since she was 20, and she was not unaccustomed to the ground shifting. Her father, Magistrate Arthur Dunmore, had been a precise and honourable man who wrote careful judgments in a careful hand until a winter fever took him and left her his name, his law books, and a debt to a Nottingham solicitor that was not quite equal to the value of the house. There was no uncle to take her in, no settled relations of any kind. There was only the advertisement in the county paper and the interview at Dunvale, where the Dowager Lady Ines Braye had looked at the magistrate's daughter in her second-best dress and said she supposed she would do until someone better presented. No one better had presented, because there was no one better, and Lady Ines had known her own mind for 67 years and had understood Willa's within a fortnight. She was a woman who had no patience for flattery and considerable patience for disagreement, who kept her own account book in her own hand despite the gout in her fingers, who once told Willa that the most honest sentence in the English language was "I was wrong about that," and that most people managed it only once before they died, if then. She told Willa, near the end, that Huxley Nairn had a smile that arrived before the situation required it, and that she had never once trusted a man whose pleasantness was faster than his reason. It was Lady Ines who gave her the box. Not the official estate ledger that lived in Nair's office, fair copied and ruled in a clear hand, but a small rosewood case with a brass clasp containing the old woman's private record, written in her own smaller, fiercer script, of every contract let on the farms and workshops of the home manor of Dunvale, which had come to her from her own mother, and was hers absolutely, held separate from the entail. "Keep this," she had said, her hand like a bundle of dry sticks on Willa's wrist, "and say nothing until saying something will accomplish something. There is more in this box than accounts, but read the accounts first." Willa had wept afterward, not at the mystery, but at the trust. No one had trusted her with anything since her father died. Her dismissal was postponed by arithmetic. The household accounts were 4 years in arrears, and the only person at Dunvale who could make a column of figures give up its secrets was the magistrate's daughter who had grown up reading court records. Orrin mentioned this to Sir Cormac with great tact and downcast eyes, and Sir Cormac said that Miss Dunmore might stay until the books were settled, that she was to be paid, and that he did not wish to hear about it further. Willa understood perfectly. It was not generosity. It was the convenience of a man who signed what was put before him rather than read it, because reading his mother's affairs required him to be present in a house where his mother had lived, and that presence cost him something he could not yet afford to spend. She was sorry for him in a brisk and practical way, and she used the time he had inadvertently given her. She began with the tradesmen's bills. She paid the honest ones that had been standing 2 years. She had the kitchen accounts ruled fresh, the linen inventoried, and sent the glazier on her own authority to look at the north-facing windows in 3 farm cottages, entering it in the household book in a plain hand and leaving it to be questioned if anyone chose. Nobody chose. The servants who had been drifting about the half-stripped house found that there were wages on the proper day and meals at regular hours, and they attached themselves to her with the quiet loyalty of people who have been adrift, and then are not. Reuben Coates's wife sent 3 dozen eggs and refused to hear of payment. Widow Stain, who had lived in the southernmost cottage on the lane for 40 years, began leaving windfalls from her apple tree on the kitchen step without announcement. It was in the 2nd week that Willa found the first wrongness. A receipt in the estate file in Nair's own hand, acknowledging delivery of 1,200 board feet of dressed oak for the repair of the granary roof, dated the previous October. She had walked past the granary in November, and the roof had 3 open joints she could have put her arm through. She checked the receipt against the accounts ledger. The timber was entered as received, and the charges paid in a sum that would have bought twice the timber and the labour to set it. She checked Lady Ines's rosewood box. There, in the old woman's hand, granary roof, materials authorised, no work completed as of December. Nair says spring. This is the 2nd spring I have heard that. One entry might be a slip. She spent 3 evenings going through the file entry by entry after the house was quiet. It was not a slip, it was a method. Materials charged and never ordered, repair funds drawn from the estate quarterly and carried somewhere she had not yet located. She could see the shape of the absence. She could not yet see what filled it. She said nothing, because Lady Ines had told her to say nothing until it would accomplish something, and an accusation without the 2nd ledger was only an allegation. The house arranged proximity without intention. Sir Cormac had taken to sitting in the evenings in his mother's library, the one room not stripped for the estate sale, and one wet night he found Willa there cataloguing law books for the solicitor's inventory, and did not send her away. He asked, without preamble, whether his mother had spoken of him at the end. She told him the truth, that his mother had spoken of him often, and had been proud of him in a manner she considered too important to say directly, which was, Willa had observed, how Lady Ines expressed everything she felt most deeply. Something moved in his closed face, not softening the preparation for it. He stayed. She read him a passage from one of his mother's letters, and Lady Ines's voice came up off the paper, dry and precise and entirely alive, and somewhere past the 2nd candle he said, without looking at her, that he had not come home in 4 years, because Halifax was easier than watching his mother grow old, and that he knew perfectly well what that amounted to. Willa said that distance was usually cowardice, wearing the coat of necessity, and that people generally knew the difference and chose not to say so. He looked at her the way he had looked in the lane, not with surprise, exactly, but with a slight recalibration, as though he had measured something and found it larger than expected. He said his mother's letters had mentioned a companion who beat her at piquet. Willa replied that his mother had been letting her win, and that they both knew it. He did not seek her out after that. But he stopped avoiding the room she occupied, and in a house that size that was its own kind of language. It was Orin who led her to the second ledger, not by saying anything directly. He was too careful a man for that, but by mentioning, to the heir slightly to her left, that Mr. Nairn rode out Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that the estate office was unlocked when he did. She thanked the heir, and on Thursday she went in on a plausible errand and found it on the shelf behind the clean ledger. 2 books, bound identically, one for showing and one for knowing. The second was meticulous. Nairn was, whatever else he was, a thorough man. 8 years of diverted funds, entered by quarter, by contract, by property, materials invoiced and never ordered, repair charges drawn and pocketed, and toward the back, a column with a small abbreviation that took her a moment to decipher. His initials, followed by the name of a mill outside the county. His own mill, bought 8 years ago with Dunvale money, grinding Dunvale grain at a rate he had set himself, and the difference had been building quietly in a bank account in York. He came back early. She heard the horse in the yard and had time to close the book and set it back before he filled the doorway. He was a large, pleasant-faced man with good broadcloth and a manner that had served him very well for 8 years under an absentee baronet and a bedridden dowager. He looked at her with the comfortable tolerance of a man who is not worried. He said he was surprised to find her here, given that her tenure at Dunvale was already concluded, and that it would be unfortunate to complicate a reference. She showed him the glazier's invoice she had brought as pretext. He looked at it, then at her. His pleasantness did not alter, which she found more alarming than anger would have been. He said that companions who had outlasted their appointments had a habit of becoming inconvenient, and that the estate's sale was next week, and that when the house was dispersed, everything in it would be accounted for very carefully. Companions, he said, were sold with the furniture, Miss Dunmore. She thanked him for the warning, and left with her spine straight and her satchel exactly as she had brought it. Alone in the still room with the door bolted, she allowed herself 3 minutes of standing very still, with her hands flat on the oak table. Then she stopped and went back to work. What hardened her from caution into purpose was a wall. She walked past Widow Staines' cottage 2 days later and saw the south face bowing outward at the foundation. The estate record showed that wall repointed 2 years prior. The mortar was original and the colour of old bone. She counted the days to the contract renewal. She had 10. She went to Reuben Coates and told him what she had found, and he sat with it the way a man sits with a truth he has suspected long enough that it no longer surprises him but still has weight. He said he would stand behind what she could prove. She asked if the other tradesmen would. He said he would ask them, and that she should not mistake quiet for defeat. The craftsmen of Dunvale had been quiet for 8 years, and their memories were not shorter for it. She spent 4 evenings going from workshop to workshop in the fading light. She showed each man and woman his or her own contract against the estate's record of it. She showed them where the numbers disagreed, and by how much. She took their signatures, and the counterpart receipts they had kept against all expectation, and the work orders that matched no ledger Nairn had ever shown the family. She told them all one thing more, that Lady Ines had made provision, and that on the day of the contract renewal they should do nothing until they saw what she brought with her. Reuben Coates, looking at her over his unlit pipe, said that the old lady had always known what she was about, and that he took it the apple did not fall very far. The estate sale came first. The county gathered at Dunvale on a clear September morning to watch Lady Ines's furniture carried into the forecourt and catalogued. Sir Cormac stood apart in black, accepting condolences with the stiffness of a man who has decided endurance is the same as composure. A Miss Dorinda Quelch arrived early, handsome and purposeful, 30 years old, with her whole future leveraged against the hope of becoming Lady Braye. and she had spent the previous month writing letters to every connection in the county about the magistrate's daughter who had installed herself at Dunvale. It was Nair who had told her where to write and what to say. What arrived at noon in a hired chaise was a solicitor named Forsyth, acting for a speculator who had purchased the late magistrate Dunmore's outstanding debt for a fraction of its face value and intended to collect it in full. He crossed the gravel and announced before the assembled guests that Miss Willa Dunmore had evaded a legitimate financial obligation, that her late father's estate remained in arrears, and that she would come with him to answer for it before the circuit court. Nair stepped forward half a beat later, with the expression of a man who regrets being called to duty, and said that he was sorry to add that the household accounts Miss Dunmore had lately been engaged to reconcile had been found to contain irregularities, and that his lordship would be wise to settle the matter of the companion's tenure today, before anything else went missing. The forecourt went quiet, every face turned to Sir Cormac. Willa watched his face go through something she recognised. He was a fair man. She had come to believe that, but he was 3 months from his mother's coffin, ambushed in a yard full of neighbours, looking at an estate agent of 8 years standing beside a solicitor with documentation, and at a woman he had known 6 weeks. Grief had taught him one reflex, and it was the freeze. He said, in a voice with nothing in it, that if the household was dispersing, Miss Dunmore's engagement was concluded with the rest, and that her wages would be settled in full. Dorinda Quelch let out a small, careful breath. Nair bowed. The solicitor moved toward Willa's elbow. She stepped back once. Then she stood still, and found that she was not going to weep, and not going to explain herself to a yard full of people who had not earned the explanation. She heard her own voice come out level across the forecourt. She said that she required nothing from that house except what she had carried into it. She said that accounts had a way of settling themselves, and that in 9 days it would be the contract renewal at Dunvale, and that anyone with an interest in the estate's dealings might wish to be present to hear what the books said. She curtsied to Sir Cormac exactly the depth his rank required, and not 1 inch beyond. She thanked Orin before all of them for 31 years of honest service. Then she picked up her satchel and walked out of the yard. Reuben Coates's wife was waiting at the workshop gate with the kettle already on. The contract renewal was held by Dunvale custom at the estate office by the mill pond, with the land agent at the table and the new season's contracts laid out for signature. Nair sat at the head. Beside him, a solicitor from London sent to observe the settlement. Behind them, because the estate required at least the form of his attention, Sir Cormac Braye. The tradesmen came up the lane together. This was the first wrong sign, because tradesmen come singly, shuffling cap in hand. They came all of them together with their wives, walking the way a jury walks when it has reached its verdict before entering the room. Reuben Coates came first. He set his tools on the table, not the walnut chest, but the specific tools used for Dunvale contracts, the ones with the estate mark stamped into the handles, and laid his broad hand flat over them and said he was ready to renew, and would renew that day, but not to the agent's signature alone. Dunvale's craftsman would sign to the receiver Lady Ines had lawfully appointed, and to no other hand in the room. Nair laughed and asked what receiver. The tradesmen parted, and Willa Dunmore walked between them in her grey dress, carrying the Rosewood box, and it was Widow Stane who said, into the silence, that this was the one they'd turned out with the furniture. Willa set the box on the table. She unlocked it and laid out Lady Ines's deed of agency, executed in the last month of her competency, naming Willa as sole receiver of Dunvale's home contracts for a term of 5 years, witnessed by the estate's own solicitor, and Lady Ines's physician, both of whom stood in the crowd behind her by arrangement, both nodding. Then she laid out Lady Ines's private account book beside the estate ledger. Then the second ledger, Nair's own, which she had asked the London solicitor to retrieve from the estate office that morning under the authority of the deed, and which he had done, and which now sat on the table in Nair's full view. Then the counterpart contracts, the receipts, the sworn statements from every tradesman at Dunvale, every work order that disagreed with the ledger Nair had shown the family. The York bank record traced from the mill deed she had found in the drawer and matched against the muniment room that same night. 11 items in 12 minutes, no voice raised anywhere. Sir Cormac read. She stood on the opposite side of the table and watched him read, and she watched the moment the freeze broke. It did not break as anger first. It broke as something older and quieter, the look of a man who has understood something about himself he would have preferred not to. He came to the page that bore his own countersignature, approving a materials invoice for the granary roof that had never been repaired, and he put his finger on it, and he said aloud, before his tradesmen and his servants and a London solicitor and the woman he had dismissed with his furniture, that he had signed what was put before him for 4 years, because reading his mother's estate required him to be present in her absence, and that the man beside him had stolen with a pen, but that he himself had held the door open and he knew it, and that Dunvale had 2 men's debts to reckon with, not one. It was not a comfortable sentence to say in company. The county repeated it for a year. Willa thought the repetition was its own kind of justice. Nair's pleasantness lasted until the 3rd column of his own 2nd book was read aloud. Then it dropped, and what was underneath was small and certain, and without any remorse at all. He said she had been nothing but a paid ear at a dying woman's pillow. Willa said that she had been paid to be precise, and that she had been, and that perhaps he ought to have considered that before he kept such very tidy accounts. The constable arrived within the hour. At the winter assizes, Nair was convicted on the evidence of books he had written himself, because he was a thorough man even in his dishonesty, and thoroughness does not discriminate. His bond was called in. The York account was seized. The mill outside the county was sold. Every shilling that could be traced back went back to Dunvale, and Willa accounted for it personally and put it into walls. Widow Staines' south face first, then the granary roof, then every cottage on the home lane with a window a child could feel the winter through. He was sentenced to transportation, and the village, which had endured his pleasantness for 8 years, discovered within a month that it could barely recall the sound of his voice. Forsyth had come to the contract renewal, expecting to witness a disgrace. What he witnessed instead was the Dunvale solicitor reading aloud from the 2nd bundle in the Rosewood box. A letter from Lady Ines to her own attorney, written in her last competent year, documenting the late magistrate Dunmore's estate in full, the speculation on the outstanding debt, and the grounds on which that debt could be challenged in Chancery on the terms of the original trust. Forsyth was offered a choice: Chancery publicly, with Lady Ines's letter entered into evidence, or immediate settlement at face value, no interest, no conditions, signed that afternoon. He signed. He left Dunvale at 4 o'clock, and Willa stood in the yard and watched the chaise go and allowed herself one moment of standing entirely still before she went back inside. Dorinda Quelch did not leave. That was the one thing Willa said in her favour afterward, and it turned out to be enough to build on. She came to Reuben Coates's kitchen 2 days later, alone, without her good coat, which Willa thought was brave, and she said that she had written letters she was not proud of, and that she had done it because she was 30 years old with a mortgaged name and 2 younger sisters and no income that was her own, and that she had aimed the only weapon available to her at the nearest available target. Willa listened to her and thought of herself at 20, answering an advertisement and travelling 200 miles north because the alternative was worse. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She did not pretend the harm away. But she went to Sir Cormac, and it was Willa's asking, and everyone in the county knew it was Willa's asking, that settled on Dorinda the management of the new lending library at Dunvale village, at a salary dependent on no one's charity. Within 18 months, the sharp eyes that had hunted out Willa's vulnerabilities were hunting out which families in the valley had no books and finding ways to bring the books to them. The county argued for years about whether that was better than she deserved. Willa thought the arguing itself was a form of health returning to the place. Sir Cormac came on foot to the workshop lane the week after the assizes, past Reuben Coates's gate where the old dog inspected him at length, and had to be spoken to twice before it was satisfied. He had no prepared speech, which Willa noted. He had nothing to offer her that she did not already have, which she noted more. He asked whether Miss Dunmore, as receiver of Dunvale's home contracts, would consent to direct the full restoration of the estate, on proper terms, through her own solicitor, for the duration of the deed of agency. She said she would. They shook hands over the gate, like two farmers settling a fair price. Coates's youngest, watching from the tool-room, told his mother that the Baronet had smiled, actually smiled, and was not believed for a week. Through autumn and into the cold months they rebuilt. The south wall held. The granary roof was re-timbered with honest oak from an honest supplier. And Reuben Coates checked every joint himself. Every contract at Dunvale was drawn fresh, read aloud to both parties, and signed in daylight with a witness present. The first work order Sir Cormac countersigned without being asked was Widow Staines' chimney, which had smoked in a north wind for 6 winters. His regard for Willa was visible to the entire village before the first snow fell. It was visible in the way he rode the lane she walked, and in the way he now read everything, slowly, with his full attention, as though it were a discipline he was learning late and meant to master. The village made quiet wagers about when it would become visible to Sir Cormac himself, and waited with the particular patience of people who have seen difficult things come right, and know it cannot be hurried. He came to the midwinter supper in the workshop hall, a gathering the craftsmen had held for 40 years, though it had not been merry for most of them, and the hall was warm, and the tables long, and the fiddler already tuning when Sir Cormac Braye crossed the floor in the hush, his crossing made, and stopped before Willa Dunmore and asked her, before Reuben Coates and Widow Staines and Orrin, and all the tradesmen of Dunvale, whether she would do him the honour of becoming his wife. And because he had learned, over a long autumn, to say the full thing rather than the comfortable portion of it, he said the rest. He said he was aware she required nothing from him. The deed of agency was sealed and irrevocable. Her solicitor was her own. Her position at Dunvale had been earned through 12 days of very quiet courage, and was hers by right. He was not offering her shelter, he said, because she was the one person in the county who had never needed it. He was asking, he said, because his mother had left him a Rosewood box, and it had taken him from September to December to understand what it contained. What it said was that the truest thing at Dunvale had been standing in front of him since the morning she faced down his agent over a carpenter's tools. And he did not intend, he said, to be a man who froze on the second occasion. The hall held its breath. Willa looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she would accept, on conditions. He said gravely that he would like to hear them. First, that Widow Staines' chimney be seen to before the wedding, as she had been patient about it for 6 years and deserved better than another winter of smoke. Second, that no contract on any Dunvale property, to the last day of his life, be signed without being read aloud by at least one party who had not written it. And third, that he be advised the piquet scores would be recorded honestly going forward, which was more than his mother had ever agreed to. Sir Cormac laughed, and the hall heard it, and the fiddler, a man of good instincts, struck up before the echo had quite finished. They were married in the village church in February, quietly at her preference, with Reuben Coates and Orrin as witnesses and Widow Staines in the front pew, in a good coat with the buttons freshly polished. The children from the lending library threw dried rosemary at the door. In the spring, Willa received at last the settlement from her father's estate, recovered in full, with the speculator's collected interest returned under the chancery terms Lady Ines had arranged before she died. She did not put a penny of it toward the great house. She built on Dunvale land a workshop hall with a south-facing wall and honest timber and a reading room off the east end, and let it to the Craftsmen's Guild at a fair rent. The first key was carried in procession by the whole village, because the whole village insisted, to Reuben Coates, who held it up in the pale February sun, and said that this was what it looked like when an account was kept honestly from beginning to end. The hall was called Ines Hall, and the beam over the reading-room door was carved with one line, chosen by Lady Ines's son, and cut by Reuben Coates himself, which read, "A contract read is a contract kept." Orrin stayed on into a great old age, and it is from his telling, passed down the stable-yard the way truest histories travel, from hand to hand while the work is going, and the horse between you doesn't judge, that the account of Willa Dunmore and Dunvale comes down at all. He would say that he had watched a great house go quiet by small neglects, and had watched it come back by small accountings. A contract read fair, a wall built plumb, a set of tools returned to the hands that owned them. And the finest thing he witnessed in 31 years of service was not the assizes, and not the wedding, and not the county bowing at last to the woman it had turned out with the furniture. It was an ordinary Tuesday in a good year when the tradesmen of Dunvale came up the workshop lane in the ordinary way, singly easy, without ceremony, to the table under the linden where Lady Braye sat at the account book with ink on her thumb and Sir Cormac stood at her shoulder. Not because the contracts required him, because he liked to watch the columns come out true. Lady Ines's portrait hung in the reading room where the morning light found it every day, and no one at Dunvale said, "I am sorry for your loss" anymore. They said her name, and they kept the books honestly, and they read every word before they signed, which was, as she had always maintained, the only form of respect worth giving to anyone, living or dead.